When it comes to guitar gear and guitar tones in 2025, the nostalgia for the 1980s and 1990s is not just growing, it is actively accelerating, as we've seen with a bunch of new product releases, not just around this year's NAMM show, but over the past 2 to 3 years. Now, I started playing guitar in the early 2000s, at the time when nu metal was still reigning supreme, so I really feel like it's come around full circle where now even those sounds are considered nostalgic. So I wanted to talk about a few pieces of gear that have been released recently that really lean into that 80s and 90s aesthetic. Some that I think really nail it, and some that I feel like are just cynical cash grabs and nobody has asked for them at all. So we should start with one that's come out in the past week, the MXR Rockman X100 reissue in a pedal format. I just did a video with this on my channel, and it's already one of the most popular videos that I've done in the last couple of years because, surprise, surprise, that clean sound that was on every other record in the 80s is embedded onto an entire generation who not just lived through that, but who were children at the time. For me, someone who was born in 1988, I grew up listening to not only the radio, but my parents' record collection and hearing those shimmery clean tones on so many records, whether it was Def Leppard's Hysteria, whether it was Whitesnake albums, whether it was R&B albums from that era, is just something that I find particularly pleasant. I've got a lot of nice memories attached to it. I'm sure there are people watching this who lived through the 80s with the Rockman who despise that sound for the same reasons. Maybe it doesn't map onto so many happy memories at the time. Nevertheless, I feel like MXR did a really great job in taking the Rockman X100 and making it more palatable and accessible. It's a much more compact pedal. It doesn't have the echo from the original, but it does have the iconic clean to chorus and distortion modes on there, and it is in an MXR size pedal that you can fit onto your pedal board. The noise floor is way lower than the original, and it's a great example of taking something that's iconic and improving it in the right ways. Another product that comes to mind that came out last year is the Soldano X88IR. Now, X88s and particularly X99s are basically unobtainium at this point. There was a period around the time I started playing guitar where you could get 80s rack gear on the cheap because no one wanted it. That's how I got into chasing tone a lot of the time, reading about my favorite players using Soldano or ADA gear, and you could pick this stuff up for a couple of bills. Well, as people like myself have got older and, lusted after these classic pieces of gear, and someone like myself making demo videos, or Michael Nielsen making demo videos with his awesome rack collection, or someone like Michael Torin collecting all the rack gear, understandably, these have become more desirable. More people have wanted them. They've probably got the disposable income to obtain them, and the vintage prices have gone up. What I like about the Soldano X88IR is an X88 is so hard to find, they're so expensive now, but it's also just a tube preamp. With the X88IR, Soldano added extra modes, they added IR loading and power amp emulation. They basically made it a whole lot easier to integrate into a modern rig while still giving you the classic look and the classic tones. They've done a similar thing with the Rack SLO 100, which I would love to get my hands on at some point because it's a purple rack Soldano. Who doesn't want a purple rack Soldano? So it's very cool to see products like the MXR Rockman and the Soldano X88 come out. Those are things that when I was younger, I thought we would never see again. And for pure nostalgia purposes, fantastic. You can go out there and buy these. They're accessible, they're affordable, but also there are improvements on them that make it a lot easier for you to use them. I think that's really important when it comes to these vintage gear reissues. Something that I don't think quite hits the spot is something like the Gibson Victory. Like, who really ever wanted a Gibson Victory? I can't ever think of that. It wasn't a popular design at the time, and then they've changed a bunch of things from that original design. And some of the finish options, again, not my taste. And I did play a few when I was in the States recently, and they didn't really impress me in any way with the playability or the tones that you could get out of them. It just kind of felt like the sort of product where you go, well, if I was going to spend $24.99 US, I would probably want something that's either going to look like a Les Paul or an Explorer or a Flying V rather than something like the Victory. And yeah, that one just kind of feels like a miss in my opinion, even though I feel like something like the Les Paul Traditional that came out, 2009, 2010, and was basically a reissue of the Les Paul standards they were making in the 80s, was a great way of taking a design that people used at the time, people appreciated, and just added a few little tweaks on there, made it accessible to a wider audience. So something like the Gibson Victory to me is definitely a swing and a miss. One that I am on the fence about until I try them are the new Peavey pedals. Like Peavey have a Bandit and a Decade and a Rockmaster preamp pedal. If you've seen my channel, you've probably seen the demo of the Peavey Rockmaster preamp, one of the best tube preamps ever made, in my opinion. They've also got a VTM preamp pedal. Now, I haven't tried these, but I'm curious to know if Peavey are just rebranding existing distortion circuits and calling them by recognizable brand names or product names, like it's just a cynical IP exercise, or if these are actually going to sound really cool. I am super tempted to try a Bandit, and that's a great example of 90s nostalgia that we've probably all played a Peavey Bandit at some point and probably gone, you know what? This kind of sucks. But at the same time, it's not as bad as it could be. So having that tone in a pedal format is interesting. And then things like the Decade, when you have popular players like Josh Homme out there using affordable gear. I feel like this happened to me when I was a kid as well, like Jack White using all this very affordable gear that no one wanted, and overnight, because it had an association with a very popular player, that it rocketed up in value. So until I try those Peavey preamp pedals, the jury is out there. They might be awesome. They might just be absolute total trash with cool graphics on them. I'd be curious to hear what you all think about that. Another 90s themed reissue that I've seen people absolutely frothing, and understandably, is the 2-channel Rectifier reissue. Now, my only criticism of this is that Boogie have discontinued the multi-watt rectifier, which is one of the most popular and versatile amps in their lineup. All the clips I have seen with the 90s dual rectifier, and by the way, I think it's a terrible name for an amp. What's it called? Well, it's called the 90s dual rectifier rather than just the dual rectifier, or, what were they up to? Revision G, Revision H? Just give it a cool buzzy name like Rev something. Call it Rev X, Rev Triple X. Why not? Absolutely go in on that. But the clips that I've heard sound really, really good. And my old Revision G rectifier is an amazing sounding amp, but there are so many issues with it. The relay switching I've had serviced multiple times. It's been blowing fuses and tubes over the years. It's not an amp I would ever take out to shows anymore, just because it's a little bit unreliable. So I feel like hopefully they fix some of those reliability issues with that, and just being able to get that sound, which when I was a kid, Linkin Park, Hybrid Theory, that guitar tone, that wall of sound. And I have seen people say that that was actually like a Mike Morin modded Marshall, but nevertheless, to me, that's like in that category of just that wall of sound, dual rectifier, sledgehammer hitting concrete kind of tone. It's awesome that they're making it more widely available. The price, like anything now that Boogie are owned by Gibson, is going to raise a lot of eyebrows, but also everything is so expensive now. Like when you're paying $6 or $7 for a coffee here in Australia, that probably scales with inflation to what the cost of a rectifier was. Speaking of amps, Marshall have finally released some amps that come from the factory with popular mods on them. There's a Plexi mod and a JCM 800 mod on there. This is about time, because Cherrytone have been doing this for years and been doing it a lot cheaper. Friedman have been doing this and absolutely nailing it. I'm so surprised that it took until 2025 for Marshall to get around to reissuing these amps. So again, a bit of like 80s nostalgia in there, where every man and their dog was modifying Plexis and 800s at the time to get more gain, to get better behavior at lower volumes. However, the price on them for what are essentially pretty straightforward mods is, in my opinion, pretty ridiculous. If you compare the price of a 2203X versus the kind of modded version on there, it's pretty wild that it's that much more expensive. I guess in their defense, if you buy an amplifier off the shelf, it has to be compliant with all the different safety codes in different territories, and that costs money to do compliance testing. We did a podcast episode on the Gear podcast with Santiago Alvarez, who designed the Marshall JVM, the YJM, the AFD, and he went into depth talking about compliance and things like that. So if you want to release a modded amp, you also have to go through all that compliance testing, whereas if you just buy an amp off the shelf and mod it, well, the compliance testing is for the unmodded amp. You can put flamethrowers into your amp and like a nuclear fusion reactor, and it's going to be all good. It doesn't have to pass compliance testing again. So maybe that's part of the cost as well, but that's a hard sell, especially in the United States, where you've got things like Friedman already well established. And again, Cherrytone have been doing modded Marshalls for so long. Their Plexi All Access is amazing. I had them make me an amp called the Molecular, which is now a production amp. I've got a bunch of videos with that. I think it's an amazing sounding modded Marshall, but I guess again, in their defense, it doesn't say Marshall on the box. And Marshall, like Gibson, like Boogie, are now lifestyle brands. So that's something that definitely plays into it. For pure 80s nostalgia, you've also got Tyler Guitars, who are now producing a lot more of their American-made models. I was lucky enough to tour the Tyler factory when I was in the States recently. And Rich Rankin, who is in charge of Tyler now, mentioned that, yeah, basically their production has ramped up massively in the last 4 or 5 years. And they're selling a lot in Asia and East Asia, where players like Dan Huff and Steve Lukather are still massively influential. They've also launched James Tyler Guitars China, where they're going to be manufacturing guitars in China with oversight from Tyler. I'm really curious to see how that goes. PRS are obviously a great example of taking their very popular, very pricey core models and then making versions of them in Asia and East Asia. I'll be really curious to see how the James Tyler Guitars China are priced and what the specs are like on them. But if you're into that aesthetic, being able to get a Tyler in Australia that isn't 14,000 Australian dollars, I think is going to be very attractive to a lot of people. I was able to check out some of the James Tyler Japan guitars that they make. They're made at the Divisor factory. I toured the Divisor factory back in 2018 or 2019, and they were amazing to me. I've got a video vlog up on my channel about that. But yeah, seeing the Tylers kind of go from, oh my God, that's such a really weird 80s thing, and that headstock and those finishes, to being, you know what? I can live with the headstock, and the finishes are kind of awesome, and they're super unique, and you can get so many cool sounds like that Tyler preamp paired with something like a Soldano X88 or the MXR. That's going to be your highway to those greasy 80s tones. I feel like we're also seeing the influence of those kind of factory modded designs in things like the newer Fender Strat Ultra 2 series. I've got a Strat Ultra 2. I love it. Compound radius, big frets, HSS configuration, locking tuners, a 2-point trem. It's basically everything I would want on like a Jackson or Charvel style guitar, but Fender are making it, and it says Fender on the headstock. And again, it's a lifestyle brand thing. These things matter to people. The tones can be great, but there's that little bit extra that people are going to pay money for with brand recognition. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, if you think people are just suckers for paying for the name on the headstock, there's lots of other options out there. All of these things you can probably find already in various guises, but these brands are obviously receptive to the demand out there, like the Rockman pedal. So many people left messages on my video saying that they immediately ordered one after seeing it was released. They hadn't even watched the clips. They just wanted that connection to a time in their life, maybe when they were first discovering music or first going out gigging, and that carries some weight to them. And if you can find a little bit of joy in some inanimate object, is that really such a bad thing? Let me know in the comment section below. Let me know how you feel about all this gear nostalgia. I'm very curious to hear from all of you. And if you like what I'm doing here on the channel, links to support me are in the video description. There's my Patreon. There's music that I make with my band Ragdoll. You can get several of our albums, EPs, and singles, as well as some merch. It all goes to support what I do here on the channel. Go and play your guitars now, and I'll see you on the next one.